2018 was a record year for shareholder activism, both in Canada and around the world. And we talked a lot about this. Targets, for example, like Detour Gold, Hudbay back in the news today as well. Our next guest expects more activism this year. Walied Soliman, one of Canada's top M&A lawyers and global chair at Norton Rose Fulbright, joining us here in studio. Thanks for stopping by.
Nice to see you, John.
It's a big theme we keep talking about. Company, all of a sudden under pressure. Shareholder activist has come forward. Tell us what exactly is going on. What is it behind this rise in shareholder activism?
Look, Canada is the most shareholder activist-friendly jurisdiction in the Western world. That's been proven time and time again. We have so many levers for activists that make this such fertile ground for them. And we're seeing that in action. We're seeing it in the mining sector. We're seeing it in the real estate sector. And now we're seeing it in the cannabis sector as well.
So the word friendly, like I think you're saying something different than Canada being business friendly. Friendly is kind of like, well, maybe you should be doing something differently with your business if you don't necessarily want to be the target of activists.
Well, look, if you're a company that is not performing well and has a diverse shareholder base or has a concentrated shareholder base that's upset, you need to watch out, because the tools that our regulators and our policymakers have given activists in this country really give them a strong hand in launching campaigns. That's why we're seeing year-over-year record numbers in this area, and it's why we're going to see continued growth in this area. Boards of directors need to be careful, and shareholders should be very happy, because boards need to know and they understand that if they're not careful, they're going to be in a lot of trouble.
When you talk about the regulatory environment being different here in Canada, can you elaborate a little bit on that, on what makes it shareholder or activist friendly?
Well, one of the most simple and easy ones to take a look at is in Canada, shareholders have the capability to requisition or require a board of directors to call an annual general meeting in between annual general meetings of a company. It's kind of like a recall right in a democracy. You have the right in between elections to have another election. That right is pretty unique to Canada, and you only need 5% of the shares, either among a group or one person, to require a company to do so. Shareholders in Canada don't have to wait until the annual general meeting of a company to effect change. They can actually do it midterm.
So you highlighted that after a very big 2018, you're expecting a lot more of this in 2019. Is that right?
I'm going to tell you something. At Norton Rose Fulbright, our special situations team, which is widely regarded as the leading in this area, has never been busier. We've got files coming out of everywhere, and I could tell you just this past weekend, we had people working around the clock on multiple files. A lot of the stuff doesn't become public, but it's a very, very, very busy season.
So I guess there's two questions that I have. One is on the activists themselves. Has word gotten around, I don't know, on Wall Street that this is a friendly place for activists to take up some healthy battles, and is it sort of the same old players that are, or is it just a whole host of different shareholder activists that are targeting Canadian companies?
Well, look, I was in Singapore last week, and I could tell you that in Singapore, Australia, East Asia, people understand the framework that we're in. We acted for an Indian company that ran an activist campaign against a Canadian company a few years ago. Definitely Western Europe and U.S. funds and shareholders understand that this is a very friendly jurisdiction. Ultimately, though, what we're seeing the most activity from is our top Canadian funds. So I'll tell you, in the real estate sector, for example, Sandpiper Asset Management out of Vancouver has never lost in Canada. They are fantastic players. They're bringing strong theses to the table, and they are convincing shareholders, and they are not only succeeding in taking over boards, they're succeeding in providing substantial returns to shareholders. We're seeing Smooth Water Capital in Canada. And of course, we're seeing many others from across the globe that are knocking on our doors.
I would think investors have a couple of schools of thought on this. On the one hand, to your point, if activists targeting Canadian companies that in the eyes of the activists are not performing, that's what makes a market. And you see ultimately what a company is worth. But there is always this concern about the hollowing out of Canada, the inability for our Canadian companies to continue to succeed globally. One would think if the company is well run and focusing on winning for everyone, shareholders, employees, the business, that they're doing the kinds of things that aren't necessarily going to attract activists. So what's that balancing act like? What are boards doing to be cognizant of this threat, but also to ensure that we just don't see, the continued hollowing out of corporate Canada?
Well, look, I distinguish between abusive agitators and ones that do good work in the market. So, for example, one of the things that we're seeing is an advent of abusive short sellers in this market, and I think that that's a very, very dangerous phenomena. Those guys need to be fought from a regulatory and a statutory perspective. We need to do everything we can to shut those folks down. In long campaigns, if you've got shareholders who are just coming in and saying, put a whole bunch of debt on the back of this company so we could dividend out some cash, those kinds of guys, in my view, need to be shut down by shareholders as well. But where we have an underperforming company and an activist with a great thesis that wants to advance it, I'm all supportive of that. Where we've got a company that's truly underperforming and a short seller who comes in with a non-exaggerated thesis as to where that there is a problem, I'm very supportive of those guys playing a role in the market.
So that's interesting. So we can lump together people like Carl Icahn, Nelson Peltz, John Paulson, these usual suspects who take stakes in companies and often push for change over a period of time, versus people who make headlines. They go out, they put out a thesis online about why they think a company is a bad bet, and they are shorting the company. This is the same pool you're saying. Activism falls under both camps.
Activism definitely falls under both camps, and I think our system needs to support those who are coming up with strong theses, both on the long side and the short side. What our regulatory system and what our boards need to be very careful of is abusive short sellers and long activists who are looking for short-term gains. Either of those, in my view, need to be shut down, either by shareholders or by our regulators. Everyone else in the middle, let's let them go. It'll increase the effectiveness and efficiency of our capital markets.
And another big story we've talked about today and for the last couple of weeks is SNC. Here's a company that's trying to put out a few fires at the same time. We don't know what investors ultimately are going to potentially push for the company to do. But what's a company like SNC supposed to do in a situation like this, where there's a lot of uncertainty around their business? And to your point, this market is one that activists often target.
Well, look, SNC is a long-term client of our firm, so I cannot comment in any way on them specifically. But let's talk about companies that find themselves in difficult situations where they're the headline of the morning news, or either for good or for bad. Look, boards of directors need to sit around a table and they need to really look management straight in the eye and say, is there a better way? We don't need to be waiting for activists or short sellers in order to react. We ought to be, as boards and management teams, encouraging these folks to take a look at situations and make determinations for themselves and up front. Is there a better way for us to drive long-term value for shareholders? Is there something we could do to make ourselves less attractive to a short? And those are questions that I think are not asked enough around the boardroom table, and that we encourage boards to do at every board meeting.
And just a final question, even about something like Twitter. I mean, a lot of these activists know how to use social media to get the word out. I would make the argument that oftentimes Canadian companies are quite slow in their response in a world which is 24-hour news cycle now. And a lot of times all these board members, even the CEOs, aren't regular users of social media. Do you think that has to change? Or, as providing the legal advice, do you think that's going to create more problems than gains or benefits?
So I'll tell you, you bring up a very, very good point. When I started my law practice, the big issue was these bull boards where people were going on and pumping up stocks and that sort of thing. And our regulators did a very effective job of just shutting that stuff down. I think the use of Twitter right now is allowing for people from behind pseudonyms and trolls to exaggerate claims and, in fact, engage in misrepresentation. And I know that our securities regulators are taking a look at that very, very hard. Having said that, whether it's Twitter or just a normal activist, our issuers need to know that in this world, you can't sit around with a group of lawyers and senior executives and put together a press release for 3 hours that an activist can reply to in a tweet in 5 minutes. Yeah. You need to be much more nimble and move quickly. Companies that don't get that will lose.
Well, a fascinating new world, and you're clearly at the center of it. Good to get your perspective on it.
Thanks a lot, John.
Walied Soliman, Global Chair and Canadian Chair at Norton Rose Fulbright, joining us here.